Imagine the gates of a great city swinging wide open, not after a brutal siege, not as the spoils of a desperate assault, but in an almost uncanny silence. Soldiers entering, banners unfurled, officials taking account, and a new order settling into place. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, capitulates in 539 BC, and the men who enter are not Babylonians at all, but Persians, administrators, scribes, horsemen, and a king with a reputation for pragmatic tolerance. How did a people who had once been tribal newcomers on an Iranian hillside come to play such a decisive role in the story of Israel? Who were the Persians, and why does their rise matter to the biblical narrative? If this question sparks your curiosity, subscribe and turn on notifications to catch our next deep dive. To answer that question, we must begin where most great stories begin, with movement. The Persians were not an ancient dynasty rooted on the same plateau for millennia. They were the product of migration, adaptation, and political apprenticeship. The groups we call Persians trace their origins to Indo-Iranian peoples who moved into the Iranian plateau in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. Among these early peoples were tribes known collectively as the Persians, Parsar in their own tongue, who settled in the southern fringe of the plateau in a region historians later call Persis or Fars. For centuries these Persians lived under the shadow of larger powers. The Assyrian juggernaut swept across the Near East. The Medes consolidated power to the north. Often the Persians were local actors under the influence of their more powerful neighbors. But such subjection was not merely loss, it was schooling. Under Assyrian and then Median dominance, Persian nobles learned the mechanics of empire, how to mobilize cavalry and infantry, how to levy tribute, how to govern diverse peoples. Those southern hill tribes absorbed administrative practices, diplomatic habits, and military techniques. Over time, a new leader would emerge who could put those lessons into action. That leader was Cyrus. Known to history as Cyrus the Great, his rise reshaped the region. Accounts that mix biblical notice, Persian inscriptions, and later Greek histories paint a picture of a man who combined political acumen, military skill, and a sense of statecraft. Cyrus united disparate Persian chiefs, challenged Median supremacy, and created something larger than any single tribe, the Achaemenid Empire. He defeated Croesus of Lydia to the west, neutralizing a powerful rival, and then directed his attention toward Mesopotamia and Babylon itself. The capture of Babylon is especially striking. Rather than destroy the city and its institutions, Cyrus appears to have entered the city in a manner that minimized bloodshed and disruption to civic life. The Babylonian chronicles, contemporary records, and later Persian inscriptions suggest a transition of power in which local elites were retained and cultic life continued. The Bible, reading this through a theological lens, records what would become an astonishing twist. A foreign king, Cyrus, is named long before his appearance by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah speaks of Cyrus by name and even calls him the Lord's anointed, Isaiah 44:28-45:1. From the vantage of Israel's faith, this was not merely a geopolitical oddity, it was providence. Scholars approach that prophetic naming with careful questions. How could a prophet speak the name of a specific foreign ruler so far in advance? But the biblical assertion remains. In the unfolding of events, Cyrus's actions intersect with God's promises. The biblical books present him as an instrument in God's hand, not by adopting Israel's religion, but by enacting policies that, intentionally or not, made restoration possible. What were those policies? To understand the Persians' role in biblical history, we must look not only at personalities, but at institutions. The Achaemenid state introduced a model of imperial governance that allowed an enormous multi-ethnic territory to be ruled without the constant imposition of cultural uniformity. Instead of obliterating local customs, Persian rulers organized their empire into satrapies, administrative provinces each overseen by a satrap. These satraps collected tribute and administered justice locally, while central oversight was provided by royal inspectors known in Greek sources as the king's eyes and ears. That combination of local autonomy and central accountability created an environment where local temples and cults could continue to function, which mattered deeply for peoples like the Judean exiles, who longed to rebuild their temple and restore their worship. Another pillar of Persian administration was infrastructure. The Royal Road, an engineered route linking the capitals and major cities, cut across hundreds of miles, enabling faster communication than had ever been possible in the region. A relay system of mounted couriers could move messages and orders across the empire with remarkable speed. For a people separated from their homeland by distance and political displacement, a connected empire made logistical return conceivable. So too did a nascent postal system, a standardized approach to taxation, and measures to facilitate trade and movement. Later Persian rulers added innovations, standardized weights, and under Darius coinage, but the early empire under Cyrus and his immediate successors had already set the pattern of governance by which diverse peoples could live under a single imperial roof. This constitutional temperament, tolerance as policy, administrative efficiency as priority, shaped how the Persians related to Jerusalem and the exiles. In the biblical record, Cyrus issues a decree permitting the exiles to return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Ezra 1 recounts this act as a turning point. The king of Persia declares that the Lord's temple should be rebuilt in Jerusalem and tasks the people who wish to return to do so with the sacred utensils taken from the temple in Babylon. Archaeology provides a fascinating coda. A clay cylinder known as the Cyrus cylinder, discovered centuries later, contains a royal inscription in Babylonian that praises Cyrus's restoration of temples across the region and his repatriation of displaced cultic objects. Historians treat the cylinder as an archaeological witness to Cyrus's policies, supportive and illuminating, but not a duplicate of the biblical account. The Bible and the cylinder together show a convergence. Cyrus's approach to the conquered peoples had an element of restoration rather than annihilation. What did that decree mean on the ground? It meant people began to return, families, craftsmen, priests and leaders, with animals and household goods, carrying traditions across tens, sometimes hundreds, of miles. Ezra 2 preserves a census of those who came back in the first wave, names, family units, and the inventory of people and resources, an almost administrative roll call of restoration. Imagine the caravans threading the royal road, laden not with treasures for the palace, but with temple vessels and portable altars, moved by a hope that had survived exile. When the returning exiles reached Jerusalem and set eyes on the ruined temple site, their emotions were immediate and mixed. The foundation was laid, trumpets sounded, people sang and wept. Ezra 3 records a scene of conflicting reactions. Older men wept because the new foundations could not match the glory of Solomon's temple, while others shouted for joy at the mere possibility of rebuilding. The image is raw. Jubilation intertwined with mourning over loss, determination tempered by the enormity of the task. Practical obstacles soon followed the emotional surge. Local opposition to the restoration project began to crystallize. Neighboring peoples, those who had been settled or had interests in the region, saw the rebuilding as a resurgence of a rival polity. They petitioned Persian officials and used legal channels to delay and frustrate the work. This is not surprising in an imperial world where local elites routinely jockeyed for favor and influence. What is surprising, at least from the perspective of the exiles, is that the imperial system which had made return possible also permitted those legal appeals. The same mechanisms that allowed Cyrus to issue a restoration decree also enabled adversaries to press complaints with satraps and secretaries. So the project stalled. The gates of possibility had opened, but progress ground to a halt. The rubble remained, and the memory of the Foundation Day tears lingered in the hearts of those who had risked everything to return. This impasse, joy mixed with defeat, hope checked by political realities, is where a theological and pastoral question becomes unavoidable. If God's promises are true, why would God's people be thwarted by human politics at the very moment of restoration? The biblical narrative moves quickly to answers that are not merely political, but prophetic. Before we turn to prophecy and to the legal maneuvers that would eventually unstop the work, it helps to pause and ask again, what kind of people were the Persians, culturally and spiritually, that they could foster such a tilt towards stability and restoration? The Persian elite were likely influenced by a constellation of beliefs and customs, among them what scholars call Zoroastrian tendencies, ideas about moral dualism, the importance of order and cosmic struggle, but it is hazardous to press these categories too far. The biblical record does not claim a wholesale religious conversion of Persia to Yahweh. Instead, it gives us a different theological reading. God can and does use the policies and personalities of foreign powers for his own purposes. That reading raises another paradox. The one who frees the exiles is not an Israelite king, but a non-Israelite sovereign. Isaiah's striking claim that a pagan ruler would be called God's anointed turns conventional expectations upside down. Isaiah 44:28-45.1. Israel's God, whose promises to the patriarchs and to David had seemed thwarted by exile, acts through a man of another nation. The deity of Israel is sovereign not only within Israel, but over empires, able to bend kings and bureaucracy alike to accomplish divine purposes. This is not to suggest that Cyrus or other Persians worshipped Yahweh. The biblical emphasis is on instrumental providence, God working through the policies of an empire that on its own terms sought stability and revenue rather than a theological restoration. Cyrus's decree thus becomes a focal point for theological reflection and historical curiosity. The return itself was no single tidy event. Ezra and Nehemiah describe multiple waves across generations, families who came with animals and tools, priests who returned to their functions, artisans who could shape wood and stone, and leaders like Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel who organized the early phases of return. Zerubbabel, a governor, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, led the laying of the foundation. Their names reappear across Ezra, Haggai, and Zechariah as central to the early restoration. The actions of these leaders were both administrative and liturgical. They had to marshal resources, placate local authorities, and oversee the re-establishment of cultic life. The opposing voices in the region did not rely solely on force. They appealed to Persian officials, invoking legal conventions and imperial records to stymie the work. In a world governed by law codes and royal archives, a local complaint could carry as much weight as an army. Those petitions led to a formal halt of construction, a bitter irony for those who had risked exile to return. The temple lay unfinished. The people were vulnerable to discouragement. Yet imperial records would later do something remarkable. They would preserve evidence that could be used to reopen the case. The royal archives and administrative habits of the Persians, central filing, inscriptional records, and an appreciating of written decrees meant that past commands could be retrieved and used to resolve present disputes. In one of the dramatic turns of the narrative, Persian administrative culture that had once enabled delay would also enable archival confirmation. Darius, a later king, would be shown the records and would affirm the earlier royal decree, allowing the work to resume and the temple to be completed. See Ezra 6. But that decisive archival confirmation lies ahead in the story. For now, pause with the people at the foundation, with their songs and their tears, with the swelling sense of a future that remains uncertain. We need to return to the figure of Cyrus for a moment, because his life and policies illuminate how the Persian model of empire functioned in practice. Cyrus's approach combined military pragmatism with political moderation. He favored local rulers who pledged loyalty, and he often restored religious cults to secure local goodwill. In Babylon, for instance, rather than impose Persian gods, his inscriptions portray him as restoring the proper gods to their cities and returning cultic objects, policies that fostered quieter integration than outright conquest. This pattern did not arise from benevolence toward Israel specifically. It arose from an imperial calculus that prized stability and the cooperation of local elites. From Israel's standpoint, however, this was providential. The Bible names Cyrus explicitly and frames his decree as fulfillment of prophetic promise. When Isaiah refers to Cyrus as the Lord's anointed and identifies him as the one who would rebuild Jerusalem, the text is claiming that God's plan reached beyond Israel's immediate context and into the affairs of empires. For the returned exiles, the theological point was practical and profound. God's promises were not thwarted by the fall of empires. Rather, God's purposes could be carried forward by the shifting hands of imperial power. The return itself was a complex social and logistical enterprise. Ezra too catalogues families, priests, temple servants, and even singers, each entry a person who chose to leave established lives in Babylon to face the uncertainty of a damaged homeland. Logistics mattered. Animals for sacrifice had to be transported, artisans had to be present, resources had to be collected. The royal road and Persian infrastructure made such movement feasible. The Persian administrative system also meant that royal permission could be issued in a way that had legal weight, enabling these returnees to take with them official authority to act on behalf of the Persian court. Once in Jerusalem, seasonal cycles and local agriculture posed new challenges. The agricultural economy of Judah had been severely disrupted. Fields lay fallow, walls were broken down, and the social fabric needed mending. Pittances of local opposition, people who had gained land and influence during the exile, saw return as a threat. These neighbors appealed to Persian officials by claiming that a rebuilt Jerusalem could become a military threat or a tax-evading polity. The imperial bureaucracy, inclined to respond to petitions, paused the work pending investigation. In such a moment, the returning community confronted a painful realization: spiritual conviction alone would not complete the temple. Political sagacity and prophetic urgency would be necessary. It is here, suspended between promise and politics, that the biblical account moves from administrative narrative to prophetic intervention. The story will soon introduce voices, prophets like Haggai and Zechariah, who insist that the people must act and that their delay is not merely political but spiritual. They call the leaders and encourage the populace to resume the work, reframing the project as part of Israel's covenantal renewal. Yet before that prophetic intervention reaches its crescendo, we should linger on another crucial strand: the Persian imperial temperament that allowed such prophetic challenge to coexist with legal appeal. The Persians, for all their orderliness, were not monolithic ideologues. Their policy of allowing local cults to function was not an expression of religious sympathy for Yahweh, but a practical means of governance. That practical tolerance had theological consequences. By not forbidding the rebuilding of temples and by restoring local religious artifacts, Persian rulers unwittingly created space for Israel's religious life to return. The biblical historian reads that space as providential. The Achaemenid state reads it as good administration. One way to see the importance of Persian institutions is to consider the alternative. Had Babylon been destroyed utterly, or had a successor empire imposed a strict uniformity of culture and religion, the return and restoration of Israelic worship might have been far more difficult, if not impossible. Instead, imperial devices, satraps who could be petitioned, roads that could be used for convoys, archives that preserved royal directives, created an environment in which legal challenge and prophetic exhortation could both be heard. That environment turned a geopolitical upheaval into an opportunity for covenantal renewal. But we cannot let the institutional story replace the human one. The people who returned were not statistics on a royal manifest. They were families with memories of temple festivals, old priests who could recite the rites, young men who had never seen Jerusalem yet carried the songs of Zion in their mouths. When Zerubbabel and Joshua laid the foundation, the trumpet blasts and the shouts of joy were not empty gestures. They were a communal exhale, the sound of breath returning to lungs long restricted. And then, as the legal obstacles mounted, those same lungs filled with a different kind of air, frustration, fear, longing for divine intervention. That longing is where the biblical narrative insists that prophecy and politics intersect. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah will not merely exhort, they will interpret the delay theologically, connecting the community's spiritual state with their vocational effectiveness. They will demand courage and obedience. The archival evidence that the Persians kept will provide the technical remedy. But these solutions are not automatic. They require human response, leaders willing to act, communities willing to repent, and kings willing to listen to the archives. At this juncture, the story of Cyrus and the early return pauses. The gates of Babylon have been opened. The decree has been issued. Caravans have moved. Foundations have been laid. Yet the work stands incomplete, stalled by petitions and old rivalries, leaving the community suspended between hope and discouragement. It is a fragile moment, full of possibility, but prone to collapse, where human resolve, prophetic voice, and imperial paperwork must align for restoration to proceed. Behind the scenes, beyond the immediate drama in Jerusalem, the Persian world continues to unfold. Persian kings consolidate power, governors administer satrapies, and the royal road persists as the empire's circulatory system. These structures will reappear in the story, sometimes as obstacles, sometimes as instruments. The biblical writers will return to the theme that God's sovereignty can operate through foreign institutions. For now, however, the focus remains on the people at the temple's foundation and on the strange providence that named a pagan king before he ever acted on behalf of Israel. As we look ahead, we will need to consider more closely the second half of Cyrus's legacy. How later rulers like Darius would validate the earlier decree from the royal archives, how prophets would call the people to renewed obedience, and how the interplay of administration and prophecy would bring completion. We will also meet figures who played out their roles in the Persian court. Xerxes Ahasuerus, a king whose reign will stage a dramatic deliverance in the Book of Esther. Mordecai and Esther themselves, whose courage and courtcraft produce a reversal of fortune and the institution of Purim. But those episodes belong to the next turns of the narrative. For the moment, hold the image of Jerusalem's half-built temple, stones laid, trumpets silent, faces streaked with tears and paint of hope. Remember that the Persians were, in large measure, organizers of large-scale life, builders of roads and administrators of provinces, people whose policies created the channels through which restoration could flow. From the Persian point of view, these policies were tools of governance. From Israel's point of view, they were instruments of a deeper restoration worked out in the mystery of providence. We stand at a hinge. The decree of Cyrus has opened the door. The returning exiles have taken the risky step of going home. The foundation has been laid, and yet the story remains unresolved. Political petitions have halted labor, and the people must now face discouragement, opposition, and the hard work of rebuilding a covenantal community under imperial oversight. The next chapter will bring prophetic insistence and archival vindication. But before that unfolds, we have to ask, what did it cost to return? What did Zerubbabel and Joshua risk, personally and politically, to stand at that foundation? What did the ordinary people, parents, artisans, priests, endure in their caravan journeys, in their nights on the road, and in their labor at the stone and mortar? These questions turn the Persian episode from a series of administrative facts into a human drama. They also remind us that the biblical legacy of the Persians is never merely institutional, it is incarnational. An imperial policy matters only because it touches real lives. The Persian tolerance and infrastructure that facilitated Israel's restoration were the means by which ordinary people could re-establish worship, memory, and identity. It is in the small, detailed acts, the carrying of a sacred bowl, the placement of a cornerstone, the shepherding of a child across a dangerous stretch of terrain, that the great sweep of empire meets the intimate demands of faith. And so the narrative pauses. An empire has made restoration possible. A prophet had named a king centuries before he ruled. Practical obstacles now threaten to unmake that restoration. What will it take to finish the temple? How will God's purposes be realized through the interplay of human courage, prophetic voice, and imperial law? The answer will unfold as the Persian machine of administration shows both its limitations and its strange capacity to preserve decrees across years and reigns. In the next movement, we will see prophetic voices rise, royal archives vindicate the cause, and a temple dedication that claims the fulfillment of prophetic timelines. But for now, the people of Jerusalem remain poised at their foundation, hope held in one hand, rubble in the other. The prophet's voice had to be heard above the silence of unfinished stones. Haggai and Zechariah did not arrive with armies. They came with words sharp enough to move men who had already weathered exile and disappointment. With a courage born of conviction, Haggai stood among Zerubbabel and Joshua and accused the people of neglect, their houses comfortable while the house of God lay in ruin. Zechariah, in a different register, offered visions that reframed the work, images of a future temple, of a priestly line restored, of a kingly figure who would one day embody God's purposes. The prophet's insistence was not merely sentimental, it was tactical. They called the people back to labor and to covenant, linking physical rebuilding with spiritual renewal. Their words found purchase. Where petitions to provincial officials had stalled progress, prophetic urgency reignited commitment. Hands that had been idle at the quarry picked up trowel and hammer once more. Zerubbabel resumed his governorship with renewed resolve. Joshua the high priest took his place at the altar, and the imperial machinery, which had earlier allowed local opponents to lodge complaints, now provided a remedy: record-keeping. The Persian administrative culture, its files, its royal archives, its respect for documentary precedent, would prove decisive. Tatnai, the governor of the region beyond the river, and his fellow satraps, had questioned the legitimacy of a rebuilt temple and sent letters to the court. Those petitions opened the legal door that produced delay. But in the Persian world, old decrees were not simply discarded. They were part of the record. When the right form of inquiry was made, the archives could be searched for prior commands. The account preserved in Ezra 6 tells the turning point. The search produced an earlier decree, Cyrus's authorization for the temple's restoration, written and recorded. Darius, a later king, received the hearing and, after consultation, affirmed the earlier order. The king even directed the provision of resources and protection for the project. The temple would be finished. The biblical text places this as a moment of both administrative rectitude and providential vindication. Imperial archives confirmed what prophetic voice and faithful labor had dared to attempt. When the work was completed, it did not end in a modest ceremony. Ezra 6:15 records that the house was finished in the 6th year of King Darius, on the 3rd day of the month Adar. The dedication that followed was emphatic and public. Priests and Levites were in their places. Sacrifices were offered in numbers that carried symbolic weight. 12 bulls for all Israel, many rams and lambs according to the text, and the people celebrated with rejoicing. The chronology mattered. The book reader could hear within it an echo of Jeremiah's word about 70 years of exile, Jeremiah 25:29. The fulfillment, as the community understood it, was not merely the completion of a building, but the realization of a promise that had survived the convulsions of empire. Yet the theological meaning of that fulfillment is subtle. The narrative does not suggest that the Persian Empire worshipped Israel's God, or that Persian policy had repentance at its core. Rather, it frames the Persian instruments, the decrees, the archives, the roads, as means through which God's covenantal purposes were advanced. Isaiah's startling oracle, naming Cyrus and calling him the Lord's anointed, see Isaiah 44:28-45:1, is read by the biblical authors as evidence that divine providence will use even unlikely actors to accomplish what was promised to Abraham, to David, and to the prophets. The Persian court, however, was not content as a mere background to Israel's story. It produced its own dramas that would directly touch Jewish life. The reign of Xerxes, called Ahasuerus in the Greek-influenced Hebrew of the book that bears his courtly tale, brings the world of palaces, eunuchs, banquets, and courtly intrigue into the story. In the halls of Susa, a Jewish orphan named Hadassah, known by the Greek form of her name as Esther, is taken into the king's service and eventually chosen as queen. She conceals her people and her identity at first, following the counsel of her relative Mordecai. Mordecai, a man of character and memory, refuses to bow to Haman, an ambitious courtier elevated by the king. Haman's offense is compounded by pride and a hatred that seeks the total annihilation of Mordecai's people. This is political peril rendered personal. A single man's ego, combined with royal power, becomes an instrument of potential genocide. Haman secures the king's authorization for a decree that would allow the annihilation of the Jews on a given day. Yet the narrative's tension is theological as well as political. Mordecai refuses to be silent, and Esther, after an initial hesitation, accepts the terrifying possibility of approaching the king unsummoned, knowing that to do so might cost her life. "If I perish, I perish," she declares in the hush before the fast she calls for the Jewish community. Her fast is not separated from strategy. It is preparation and petition, a combining of human risk and spiritual dependence. The sequence that follows, Esther's appeal, the king's sleeplessness that leads to Mordecai being remembered, the dramatic reversal in which Haman is hanged on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, reads as providential irony. The people who had been slated for destruction are preserved, and the king issues a counter-decree, allowing them to defend themselves. The days of deliverance are instituted in a festival of remembrance, Purim, commemorated in Esther 9 and celebrated thereafter by Jews as a permanent memorial of rescue. The Persian court has been the stage for both cruelty and deliverance. The very mechanisms of royal appointment and decree that made extermination possible also become the channel for reversal. The Book of Esther is striking because God's name is never mentioned explicitly. The narrative relies on providential turns, seen by attentive readers as the working of a larger hand. Court intrigues and personal courage intersect with bureaucratic detail in ways that echo the wider Persian pattern, an imperial system that prized written directives and formalized decisions. The Persian archways that facilitated Cyrus's decree now frame a royal story of life and death in which Jewish identity is tested and vindicated. Theological reflection in later Jewish and Christian interpretation has read Esther as an illustration of God's hidden providence. Things are not always as they appear, and deliverance can come through the most unlikely corridors of power. The later Persian period brought further returns and reforms. Ezra, introduced in Ezra 7, appears at the court of Artaxerxes as a priest skilled in the law of Moses. The king grants him authority to lead a group back to Jerusalem and to teach the statutes of God. Ezra's mission is both educational and judicial. He reads the law, instructs the people, and confronts moral compromises, chief among them intermarriage with neighboring peoples. Ezra 9-10 records his anguish and dramatic action as he calls the community to repentance and to putting away foreign wives as a symbol of renewed covenant fidelity. His reforms are contentious and painful, illustrating that restoration is not merely physical rebuilding, but moral and religious reorientation. Nehemiah's story overlaps Ezra's, but centers on civic reconstruction and social reform. As cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah holds a trusted position close to the monarch. When he hears about the broken walls and exposed gates of Jerusalem, he is moved to grief and prayer. He petitions the king for leave and resources. The king grants it, along with letters for safe passage through Persian territories. Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, surveys the ruin in secret, then rallies the people. With the authority of the king's backing, but without an army, he organizes the repair of the walls. Amidst opposition from nearby peoples and attempts at intimidation and subterfuge, the workers press on. Nehemiah 6:15 records the astonishing speed of their labor. The wall was rebuilt in 52 days. That number, 52, reads in the text as a sign of communal determination and divine enablement. Walls and gates were not only defensive structures, they were symbols of identity, of the city's integrity, and of the possibility of a restored social order. Once the wall was up, Nehemiah set about reforms, restoring the temple's finances, ensuring support for the Levites, rebuking the wealthy who had exploited the poor through usury, and re-establishing Sabbath observance. The people gathered to hear the law read, and Ezra stood before them. As they listened, they wept and then rejoiced, moved by a sense of being newly called into covenant. The reading of the law, the public confession, and the signing of covenant commitments in Nehemiah 9-10 form the climax of a social and spiritual refoundation. These returns, reforms, and recoveries are not a single seamless revival. They are messy, recurrent, and communal. Ezra's insistence on purity, Nehemiah's insistence on justice, and the prophet's insistence on faithfulness sometimes clash with human interests and comfort. Rebuilding a people required more than bricks. It demanded discipline, repentance, liturgical renewal, and legal integrity. Persian imperial structures, royal letters, provincial permits, and legal frameworks continued to be the means by which these reforms were effected. Acknowledgement of the king's protection was pragmatic. The deeper work depended on leaders who would marshal faith and courage at great cost. Throughout these episodes, two motifs recur. The first is providence understood as God's capacity to use non-Israelite powers to carry forward Israel's destiny. Persian kings are not portrayed as worshippers of Yahweh in the biblical narrative. They are sovereigns whose policies and decrees, for reasons internal to their imperial calculus, align with God's intention to restore the people. Isaiah's naming of Cyrus becomes the theological lens for seeing these events. When empires shift, God is not surprised. Divine purposes are not limited to Israel's immediate actors. The second motif is the institutional fact. Empires leave traces, roads, archives, decrees that can be wielded for good or ill. In the Persian case, those institutional features became channels of restoration. It is important to note how careful the biblical writers are about what they assert. They do not attribute Israel's recovery to Persian conversion. They do not suggest that Cyrus or Darius abandoned their own gods to worship the God of Israel. Instead, the texts repeatedly emphasize that God's hand can work through the policies of empire. Archaeological evidence such as the Cyrus cylinder offers a non-biblical witness that Cyrus pursued policies of restoration for temple cults and the repatriation of certain displaced peoples. Historians view that artifact as corroborative context rather than as a duplicate of the biblical account. The biblical narrative and the cylinder together form a dialogue between faith memory and material record, each enriching the other without erasing their differences. That dialogue produces interpretive caution. Prophetic fulfillment, as claimed in the biblical texts, is framed within Israel's trust in God's promises. To read those fulfillments theologically is to accept a claim. God's covenant retains priority even when political fortunes shift. To read them historically is to observe a pattern, an empire that permitted local customs and that maintained effective administration created the conditions for cultural and religious continuity. Both observations are true, and they converge in the biblical author's portrait of Persia as an arena where divine providence and imperial policy intersected. Beyond theology and statecraft, the Persian episode leaves lasting cultural and liturgical legacies for Israel. The restoration of the temple and the establishment of festivals like Purim are not mere historical footnotes. They shape communal memory and identity. The rededicated temple resumed sacrificial worship and liturgy. The reading and teaching of the law re-anchored communal life. Purim, born of Esther's story, became a yearly reminder that survival sometimes hinges on courageous petitions, on solidarity, and on remembering how deliverance came. For later readers, Jewish and Christian alike, the Persian period becomes a mirror for thinking about how God's promises endure through calamity and how ordinary people participate in renewal. Zerubbabel's courage, Esther's risk, Ezra's fidelity, Nehemiah's leadership, each offers an exemplar of faith in concrete circumstances. Each also reveals a pattern. God's purposes are realized not by miracle alone, nor by bureaucracy alone, but by their intersection. Prophecy called. Structures allowed action. People risked. If one asks what this means for understanding who the Persians were, the answer is complex. They were, in one register, a people formed by migration and imperial apprenticeship, horsemen and administrators, builders of roads and organizers of provinces. They were, in another register, rulers who developed policies that prized order and stability, often through toleration of local customs when that promised smoother governance. They were, in a third register, instruments, unwitting or otherwise, by which a sovereign God acted to sustain a people and to fulfill ancient promises. To call them instruments is not to erase their agency. It is to place them within a theological economy that allows foreign power to be folded into sacred history. There are cautionary notes in that theological reading. The biblical authors never romanticize empire. They register the moral dangers of power, the cruelty that empire can enable, and the ethical compromises that can accompany political administration. Haman's plot in Esther is one example of cruelty enacted through imperial sanction. Nehemiah's rebukes to exploitative creditors show how social injustices can persist even after national restoration. The Persian period is therefore both a tale of providential means and a reminder that human hearts remain in need of covenantal reformation. Finally, a pastoral application emerges without being preachy. The Persian story invites a posture of sober wonder that God can work through unlikely paths, sobriety about the moral ambiguities of human institutions. For people today who face broken structures, political, social, familial, the Persian episode suggests that restoration often requires both spiritual resolve and pragmatic engagement. One must pray, yes, but one must also organize, lobby, preserve records, and be willing to risk. Providence tends to meet human responsibility in the middle. History, in the Persian episodes, is never merely a sequence of facts. It is a witness to endurance. The temple stones, the names on Ezra's lists, the demographic details of returnees. The whole company was 4,360, with horses, camels, and other beasts counted for the journey. These concrete details anchor a story of real people. The temple's dedication, completed under Darius and celebrated with many sacrifices, Ezra 6:15-18, marks a liturgical and communal renewal. The wall, rebuilt in 52 days, Nehemiah 6:15, marks a civic recovery. Purim, institutionalized in Esther 9, marks a liturgical commemoration of rescue. These are not abstractions. They are the footprints of a community reconstituted. When the dust settles on the narrative, the original question, who were the Persians, resolves into a layered answer. They were builders and administrators, shaped by their history and by the needs of empire. They were pragmatic rulers who valued order and revenue, and who, by doing so, created spaces in which local identities could survive. They were actors whose policies, recorded in clay cylinders and royal archives, intersected providentially with Israel's story. Above all, in the biblical imagination, they became the unexpected instruments through which God's long-term promises to a scattered people were advanced. That reflection should not prompt theological triumphalism, nor rosy portrayals of ancient imperial systems. Rather, it should cultivate a reverent humility. The Persian episodes teach that God's work often comes through means that surprise us. Policies rather than proclamations, archives rather than miracles, an orphan queen's courage rather than an obvious military victory. They remind believers that providence is not a simple formula, but a complex weaving of human choice, institutional contingencies, and divine oversight. As we close this chapter of history, hold three images in mind. First, the open gates of Babylon, which in the hands of Persia became a gateway to restoration rather than merely conquest. Second, the foundation laid in Jerusalem with trumpets and tears, a scene of tenderness and resolve. Third, the raw courage of individuals, Zerubbabel, Joshua, Haggai, Zechariah, Esther, Mordecai, Ezra, Nehemiah, whose actions, in concert with imperial structures, restored worship, law, and walls. Who were the Persians? They were, among other things, the administrative scaffolding through which a dispersed people could return to their land and their God. They shaped the physical and legal landscape that allowed prophecy to meet politics. They provided the channels, roads, decrees, archives that made restoration feasible. And insofar as the biblical writers understood history theologically, the Persians provided the means by which God's promises to Israel continued to unfold across changing empires. If this exploration surprised you, share it with someone who loves Scripture, and leave a comment on what struck you most.